Before we dive into all of the parenting related questions, would you mind just introducing yourself briefly?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Jason Tarn, the lead English pastor over at Houston Chinese Church. And yeah, so I am married to my wife, Theresa, for 18 years, and we have two daughters. We have a 12-year-old and a two-year-old, 2.5-year-old. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic there with such a large age gap between the two of them. But yeah, I think the Lord knew what He was doing, even though for us, we didn't know exactly His plans for us. We've always wanted a larger family, but He only really provided us one for many years. And then back in 2020, during the start of the pandemic, the Lord just really surprised us and blessed us with our second daughter. So yeah, she was born at the end of 2020. Yeah, so that's me. Grew up here in Houston. And I've been at this church since I was actually the same age as my oldest daughter. I was 12 when I first started coming to Houston Chinese Church, living close by. And my first job out of college was actually working with youth here at HCC. And then in 2011, after doing my seminary studies, I moved back to Houston with my oldest daughter just as a little baby, and my wife and I moved back here to be closer to family. And I started working at HCC as in the English speaking congregation. And now, after 12 years, I'm still in that same church, same congregation, but it's in a different role now that the lead English pastoral role. So yeah, that's me.
Amazing, thanks. It's really cool to hear that you had like your one child for such a long time, but then you got the surprise
Yeah,
at the end. I
yeah. It's such a tough year for everyone, right? It was like, the worst year for so many people, but for us, we're like, wow, this year ended great.
COVID
And it
ended in
was,
an upswing.
yeah, exactly. Notwithstanding just how COVID is wrecking our society, but just for us as a family, we were like, wow, get this little baby. And then I'm still working from home, so I could be able to be really available to help. And so it was just a real great timing for us, even though, granted, it was very difficult for the rest of us, as a city, as a society. But yeah, as a personal experience, yeah, that was a real blessing.
That's great. So to start, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you were raised and your
Yeah.
parents' parenting style.
Okay, great. So yeah, I was raised by first generation immigrant parents. They are the generation born in China, but at a very early age for both of them, their families fled to Taiwan. It was during, the end of the World War II. So they're the generation of Chinese, uh, transferred over to Taiwan, grew up in Taiwan, eventually, had opportunities after college to come to the States for grad school in the early 70s. And so they came here for higher education, eventually both found jobs in the energy industry. So that's how we ended up in Houston. So both my parents worked for energy companies. And yeah, so I was, I have an older brother, 3 years older than myself, and we were both born late 70s. And so I grew up in the 80s, 90s here in Houston with immigrant first generation parents. But I would say if there's a spectrum of like Chinese immigrant parents where on one end they're stressing like cultural preservation, like I really want to make sure that my kids, know they're Chinese and value the fact that they're Chinese and embrace that. We only speak Chinese to them, and forcing them to learn the language and to appreciate the culture. Like that's on one end, like cultural preservation. On the other end of the spectrum, it's more cultural assimilation. It's like, hey, we are here in America. Our kids are American. We want them to be raised as Americans and to really assimilate well into American society. If that's the spectrum, I would definitely say my parents lean more on the assimilation side, the cultural assimilation, as opposed to cultural preservation. And so I think that speaks to just the fact of how long they were in the States before I came around. Like, I mean, less than a decade, but they were already it's pretty established in the States. Like I said, their careers were in corporate America, so they were being exposed to Western culture, American culture, very early on. Uh, being forced to learn the language, and so they were pretty proficient in English compared to like my other friends who had Chinese immigrant parents. I would say like they would always joke about how good the English was for my parents. Like when they would call and my mom would answer, they're confused because they're like they thought they were calling like some white family, and it was actually just my mom answering the phone in just like her perfect English. So they actually never forced us to speak Chinese in the home. Like they would speak Chinese to each other, like they speak Mandarin to each other, and I could understand. I mean, even to this day, I can generally understand basic conversational Mandarin, stuff you would talk about in the home. But like, they never expected us to reply to them in Chinese. They did send us to Chinese school, like Saturday morning Chinese school, and I hated it. I rebelled against that, and they were, they still wanted me to learn it, but they weren't so strict to the point where like. At some point, I was able to negotiate my way out of going to Chinese school. So yeah, and then when it comes to like American pop culture, growing up in the 80s and 90s, like yeah, they were actually pretty hands off, I guess, when it comes to just allowing me to be exposed to a lot of just pop culture. And so yeah, I just grew up a kid of the 80s and all the things that any other American kid growing up um uh in that generation would have been exposed to. Things even in the home, it's like yeah, obviously the real basic things in terms of maybe the decor seems a little bit more like a Chinese immigrant family in the home, and of course no one's wearing shoes and things like that. But even if you're in the kitchen, like I would say, my mom growing up, I'm thinking back, I don't think it was exclusively Chinese food in the home. She would actually try to make us non-Chinese um meals and prepare these dishes even to this day. Like I think she's pretty proficient to be able to make things that aren't just Chinese dishes. And my school lunch growing up, like it was never, I had friends bringing in like the uniquely Chinese dishes, and having to be teased about that. I mean, my mom just made me like peanut butter jelly sandwiches like any other American kid. I had just regular like American school lunches, and then we would always frequent American restaurants, so I wasn't deprived of that kind of an experience of going to Fuddruckers. I mean, that's a little Texas Houston, or like TGI Fridays or Bennigan's. I don't know. Those are the kind of restaurants that like even my grandparents, my paternal grandparents who ended up moving to Houston as well. Like they're the ones like every Sunday night we would go out to eat with them, and it's my grandmother actually wanting to go to like these Chili's, Bennigan's, but she doesn't want like Chinese. She wants to try American food. So like that was my exposure every single Sunday night we go out to eat, and it's always these American restaurants. So anyways, that's kind of the experience that I had. So I would say that they definitely were more lenient than the stereotypical Chinese American Chinese immigrant parent. They did care about academics. I think that's that's a given. But and they didn't care so much about like sports. Like so I wasn't encouraged or even given opportunities to sign up for Little League and all these kind of things. I mean, if I didn't express the interest, it wasn't like they were looking for these, because like nowadays, like parents are going to be like pushing their kids to try all these different sports. Like we even, I'll talk about that later. We even do that a little bit, but not so much. My parents are like, hey, if you didn't ask for it, we weren't gonna, we weren't gonna, encourage that or even thought about it. But I would say that there is one thing that was very American that they really wanted me and my brother to do, which was Boy Scouts. Like my parents were like, hey, we want you to be part of Boy Scouts, and it wasn't something that we asked for, but they just kind of signed us up for that, and they actually pushed us for that one activity to like really to we both me and my brother made it all the way to Eagle Scout, and that took a lot of encouragement and pressure from my parents. But that was like probably the one thing where they were like, "Hey, just do that, finish that." But other things like musical instruments, things like that. I mean, yeah, they exposed me to those things. But if I showed interest, that's great. But at some point, they didn't really push me that hard. to have to learn how to play these instruments or things like that. So I would say they're definitely more lenient, especially since they didn't grow up with any kind of faith background. Yet they were very open and allowing me and my brother to go to church, which was Houston Chinese Church. But we both, as teenagers, started going because we lived close by. We had friends invite us, and yeah, they like from my experience, they would just drop me off Friday nights for church, youth group, fellowship, and on Sunday mornings. Since we lived so close, so they were at least open to that, even though they didn't share any of those faith convictions. And I would say they never really pressured me towards like you have to be a doctor or an engineer, any of those kind of stereotypical like forcing me down a particular narrow career track. They were actually very American and Western in the sense of like, hey, yeah, you should do what you want, they now, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about that later. Like when it came to me finally like saying I don't want to be in Christian vocational ministry. Now that was something that, they were like, oh, okay, we weren't expecting that, but they definitely weren't like, you have to be a doctor, you have to be, a lawyer, anything like that. I didn't get that kind of stereotypical pressure from them. So yeah, I would say that's my parents' general parenting style, which I would, from my understanding, is a bit more lenient, more hands off than the stereotypical Chinese immigrant parent.
Hmm.
You were curious about how that affects my parenting style as well,
Yeah, well, we
and you
can
had questions about, yeah,
pause right there. I was
yeah,
wondering, like, to what extent would you say that this type of like pretty intense like assimilation was atypical? Because I know you mentioned like, okay, your friends
yeah,
would be made fun of, not you. But
yeah.
recently I had talked to a professor who actually was saying like that tiger parent like stereotype that everyone has wasn't quite as common for him either. So would you say that like around you the
Yeah.
tiger parents like stereotype prevailed, but not?
Yeah, probably not okay, again, based on my understanding what tiger parenting is today, it probably wasn't as intense, but definitely there were those aspects of it that I could see in some of my peers and their experience with their parents, maybe the complaints that they have of their parents and their experience growing up. So yes, I would say that I feel like my parents were definitely more Americanized. I'd be, very confident. I think they were out of in comparison, they'd be more Americanized, more lenient. Um, so I didn't have a very bad taste in my mouth when it comes to like thinking about my parents as being authoritarian and just being so like all they want from me is just to like straight A's. I mean, yeah, they didn't like it when I didn't bring home A's, but I never felt like this, the real stereotypical, like, oh, you're gonna be punished now if you don't bring home A's. It has to be A plus. I mean, they were really happy with me if I just got like an A minus. So like, oh, awesome, that's great. I mean, so they were never like so American. They're like, they would never celebrate a B or a C. But at the same time, I did not feel like real pressure that I was like disappointing them or letting the family down because I brought home, less than straight A's or anything like that. So yeah, I've always had the impression growing up that they were more Americanized than my peers, than my other like Asian American peers.
Do you feel like this openness to just not only Western culture, but just a lot of things, like you're saying, even faith and all of those things,
Yeah,
can you attribute that openness to anything in their stories and their immigrant stories that sets them apart?
that's why they would be so open to allowing me to experience those things.
Yes.
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, when I have tried to talk to them about faith, they seem to actually like respond in a very like modern, uh, atheistic response where I wouldn't really, like they're like, you know what, anyone can believe what they want to believe. Like you shouldn't have to like, like evangelize to them or tell them. I mean, I was like, oh, this is weird. Like this is what I expected. Like, the response I get from like some kind of college student. And they're very like either modern or postmodern, and they're kind of very relativistic in their view of like religious truth and things like that. So I don't know. Maybe that's partly where they weren't threatened by the fact that I was going to church simply because they didn't have very deep rooted convictions themselves. Um, and I guess also, well, in the end, just like any Asian uh, parent, they want their kid to be a good kid and have good morals. And so I guess they thought, well, if our boys are going to church on a Friday night, it's better than them doing something, illegal or dangerous, hanging out, at someone's house or something. So I guess they were just far more inclined, knowing that in their minds, going to church was a very, moralistic and generally safe environment to be in. So that probably also contributed a lot to their openness for us to be involved. Because when it finally actually started to impact my life choices, like later on when I wanted to go into to be a missionary or to eventually be a pastor, like definitely that's when they weren't as open as those days when they're simply just dropping me off the youth group, right? I mean, they're far more open to that than when they're like, whoa, you're taking this really seriously. So yeah, I mean, that's where I would imagine some of the factors for why they were okay with at least when it comes to me exploring faith during those teen years.
That makes sense. So it's more like practical reasons that like
Yeah.
he's
I
safe,
would.
like he's not doing anything bad at this point.
That's my impression.
I
Yeah.
got that. That makes sense. So I guess then kind of piggybacking now to you now, do you feel like
Yeah.
you see similarities in your parenting style with your daughters?
I think so. Yeah, and for me, a lot of it, I'll just speak from the experience of raising my oldest daughter, who's 12. Right. I mean, a lot of this is just from that particular experience of her going through, the early age, and now she's kind of in a preteen age. And I would say, yeah, like, um, yeah. I mean, I value my Chinese heritage. I do want my kids to do the same, but I think, like my parents, I would not, and I don't think I have, and I don't plan on like intentionally leaning hard towards cultural preservation. Like, oh, like I've had obviously friends growing up where they were given the expectation that you are going to marry a Chinese person, right? I mean, my parents, I don't think they ever mentioned that to me, and then I never had. I mean, I did end up marrying a Chinese American, but there was not any kind of like expectation given to me, anything explicit that I could remember. And so in the same way, like I don't plan on that or like expect like you need to, preserve our Chinese culture, into your family, into your, my future grandkids, like all that kind of, I just that's because and I probably is probably because of the way my parents raised me, where I value it, but it's not such a high priority where I'm putting kind of expectations or pressure on my kids. Now, I mean, we do worship in a Chinese heritage church, and we worship, and I serve in Houston Chinese church. So, on one hand, I mean, I got that going for me, where that they're going to be exposed to a lot of Chinese culture just simply by the nature of our church. But the main goal for why we're at Houston Chinese Church is not because I really want my kids to have Chinese American friends, and so that's the main reason why we're here. No, I now that could be a reason why some people actually do come to our church, or why some of the youth might start coming to our church, even if their parents aren't Christians. Like myself, like I came to Houston Chinese Church because wow, there's a lot of like Chinese Americans here that I could actually befriend, and that even though by the time I got to high school, I went to a high school where there was a good group of Chinese Americans, but like in middle school, yeah, I barely knew any Chinese Americans, and so it was at HCC where I was able to meet these people and kind of explore some of that identity there. So, um, even though I hope my daughters get some of the benefit of being in a Chinese heritage church, like to preserve Chinese culture was not the main goal, and for them to be befriended and have their friendship circles just be Chinese American was not the main goal. The reason why we're here is mainly because, like I said before, I grew up in this church, so I have a personal connection to HCC, and we do also have, both me and my wife have the hope that our non-believing Chinese immigrant parents will one day become Christians, or at least show more spiritual interest. And if they are going to, then of course, us being at Houston Chinese Church is a great way for them to be exposed and to be able to worship with us. So that's my prayer, right? That one day that all three generations on both my side and my wife's side, we're all worshiping together at this church. So that's probably really why we're here, more so than the preservation of culture component. So, for example, like I've never sent my kid to Chinese school, like to learn Chinese language school, even though our church does have an Sunday afternoon Chinese language school that she could be sent to. I just, me and my wife had no priority to send her to that. Um, we do want to expose them to aspects of of our Chinese heritage and culture that we as well enjoy and embrace. But if it's not something that we already embrace, then I'm not going to like expect her to be even more Chinese than me. So, I mean, I still love the food. We frequent Chinatown all the time, and so yeah, I think I would think my actually my oldest daughter's favorite kind of food now is actually Korean food. But she loves noodles too, so she loves going to get beef noodle soup and things like that. But so yeah, the food is definitely there where we're glad that they really appreciate it. And of course certain values that are still important to me and my wife, the importance of family, the importance of relational trust, things like that. I would still say that, I learned that, and it was modeled that from my parents, and those are some of the things that I still want to pass on, but to a degree, right? So like even though we enjoy Chinese food as a family, like of course we're never going to be like exclusively Chinese food, right? We're exposed to, we expose our kids to a whole wide range of cuisines, and then of course like we stress the importance of family, but I don't think like familial piety in its like traditional sense, that's something that I'm going to be like pushing hard on for my kids, even though like yeah, I want them to honor their father and mother, but so I guess so to a degree, right? And we care about academics for our kids, but as Christians, I mean, we care about their character so much more. And I can talk a little bit later about some of the school choices that we made for that, with that very a priority in mind. So, yeah, I think with my parents raising me in such a way where um, I do see some similarities. Obviously, the faith component is going to be the difference because I wasn't raised with any kind of faith component. But yeah, so but when it comes to some of the attitude towards Chinese culture, I would say just a lot of it unconsciously, right? I just kind of modeled what I was exposed to.
That's really interesting. So it definitely seems that like attitude towards culture is something that you have taken directly almost from your parents and the way you were raised.
Yeah, as I was thinking about it, I was like, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm great. It's great that you're asking these questions because it's actually forcing me to think more about it, right? And so I really appreciate even the opportunity to kind of ponder about. Oh, yeah, I guess I have been, I have been kind of raising my daughters in a similar fashion in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Do you feel like there's something that you can kind of think of from your experience growing up that you kind of explicitly have changed from the way that your parents parented?
Good question. Good question. Yeah, I mean, I would say, I'd say affection, expressing affection. That's definitely different. My wife's family, they do actually express. So there's two daughters in her family, and maybe that has to do with my parents raising two boys, her parents raising two daughters. That might have to do with it, but they're more verbally expressive of their affection, um, with each other. I mean, like to be honest, like I can't recall like many other Asian Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, I can't recall my parents ever saying "I love you," or using those words, or like we don't. That's not normal in our family life growing up. Not that I question their love. It's just that it wasn't expressed verbally that way. It's totally different now. Growing with my kids. Learning even how my wife's family communicates affection verbally, and now with my kids. And the thing is that like now I see my parents, like my dad, because he has these two granddaughters and he's so affectionate with them, and I'm like, dude, what happened? Like, why are you so affectionate now? You're willing to say I love you now. Like I never got any of that. So I think, obviously having a grandkid is different than having your own kid. It's all the good stuff, it's all the fun stuff. None of the responsibility to discipline them. So I think that's where he's just far more free now to show affection. But I think that's one thing where like, yeah, that's a generational thing. That's a cultural difference as well. Where for them, they just never, they always showed their love. They never expressed their love, explicitly, right? But I think we try to do both now, knowing that, yes, you got to show your love through your actions, but yeah, kids also need that verbal affirmation as well, right? So yeah, that's the one thing that comes to mind. I'm sure there are some other differences, but that's the one that sticks out the most.
Yeah, for sure. Something else I was wondering is you mentioned kind of the Chinese tenets, as it were, of family, like relational trust, a lot
Hmm.
of positives of
Yeah,
culture that are not necessarily like at odds with Christianity, I think you'd probably
yeah,
agree with. Is there anything that you can kind of think off the top of your head that would be a negative of Chinese culture that you've seen that's really
yeah.
clashed heads with Christianity?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And yeah, that would be, I would imagine, like again, this is the stereotypical, and again, like it's, I know you're bringing up the topic of like tiger parenting and whether some of those characteristic ways of parenting, um are they, um can they be critiqued by the Christian faith and Christian values? Yeah, I would definitely say that there are um, things that we can affirm about the stereotypical way of Chinese immigrant parents, tiger parenting, but then there needs to be an appropriate critique. And so I guess it depends on how we're defining it. I guess when I was trying to think about like what is characteristic of the stereotypical way that immigrant parents would do it, I kind of boiled it down to like four things I was thinking of. Like one would be a strict parenting style, right? So very hands on, in contrast to the more Western permissive parenting, right? Very, very hands off. Let the kid fail. Let the kid explore their own, whatever they want to do. That type of thing. Um, that's one. So very strict hands-on parenting. Another characteristic I was thinking of is high expectation for excellence, whether it's in academics or any kind of extracurricular, whether it's music, sports, whatever it is, right? Like we want you to be the best so you can get that scholarship, to be able to go to that Ivy League school or whatever. Versus in contrast to some kind of parenting style that's low expectations, low engagement. Only if you're interested, would you be are we going to sign you up for these activities or whatever it is. Another third thing I could think of was highly disciplined in instilling a high sense of discipline, to be very perseverant, to be very gritty. Like you don't quit. You're gonna do it, and you're gonna finish. Whatever it is. Like and you're not gonna quit. And that's in contrast to like, oh, only if you really enjoy it. If you're really passionate about it, go for it. If you don't like it anymore, we'll try something different, right? I think that's the difference. And then the fourth thing is uh a performance-based affirmation, right? So like, yeah, you'll get affirmation somehow if you do well and if you meet these high expectations. In contrast to a type of parenting style, which is like, hey, at least you tried, very participation based, like a participation trophy, here's your ribbon, good for you. You tried your best. So proud of you. Obviously tiger parenting is like, no, no, you didn't excel, so those are the four things that I was thinking about. Was like, yeah, okay, so that's characteristic. So again, strict parenting style, high expectation for excellence, highly disciplined, and performance-based affirmation. And I would say Christianity can affirm some things, but definitely critiques something in all four of those. So for the first one, I would say Christian parents could also be critical of a very permissive attitude, a permissive style of parenting. I think we should encourage a more hands-on approach. But the question is, I guess, like where are your hands and what are those hands doing? Like, are your hands grabbing your kid by the collar and dragging them in a certain direction that you want them to go, or are your hands gently on their back and you are trying to encourage them and nudge them in a certain direction, affirming them, patting them on the back when they are taking the necessary steps in that direction. But in the end, I can't push my kid there. Like if I've got my hands on my back and I'm pushing them, in the end, it's not going to I'm not going to achieve my ultimate goals there. So I think that's something where I do think there's something to be affirmed, that we don't want to be just completely hands off and just let your kid, whatever they want to do. But at the same time, so it also goes with like rules, and like, are there rules in the household, and are there consequences for breaking those rules? Very permissive parenting styles, like, oh yeah, hey, there's no rules, we just got to trust each other and negotiate things. Versus like, I do think from a Christian point of view, there needs to be rules. There needs to be law, just like in the Christian faith. I believe that God's law is good, and God's authority is also a good thing. So I think there's importance about teaching kids to respect the authority of their parents, and to respect the rules that they have set over you. But again, stressing that the authority of a parent is delegated by God the Father. So ultimately, like, it's God the Father who has all the authority, and He delegates authority to my own parents to raise me, right? And that's an authority to respect. And then also that these rules for the household, are they derivative of Holy Scripture and God's own word? And I think if we can, as parents, make it clear that, hey, look, I have an authority over you, and I have rules for this household. But again, I'm only basing my authority and these rules off of what the Lord has provided for us, right? So I think that step needs to be there in Christian parenting. And then hopefully, teaching our kids to actually grow up, whether they always agree, with our rules, and whether they always submit to our authority. At least they grow up not thinking inherently or instinctively that rules are bad, that authority is distrustful and oppressive. Like, if they grow up with that kind of impression, then that's not setting them up well for being able to follow God and to follow and to respect His rules and live under His authority. So I think that's where I do agree with more hands-on, but not to the strictness of maybe you would imagine tiger parenting, where they're like, I've got rules for you, but it's based on directing you in a way that I want you. I'm trying to mold you into my image, type of a vision. Versus like, yeah, I want my kids to be molded, but not into my image, but into the image of God. And so there are rules for and to move in that direction, and there is authority that I have to guide them in that direction. But in the end, it's the image of God that I'm stressing. And then same thing for like, you know excellence and the striving for excellence. I think Christian parents obviously should encourage their kids to strive for excellence, but the question is like, for whose sake? Like, if for whose glory, right? Like, whose goals are you trying to excel in? Is it something for your own glory and just to achieve the parents' goals for the kid, or is it ultimately for God and His glory, for His goals for us? And so that's another. It's something that we should be affirming, striving for excellence, but then again, for whose sake? And then the other thing about like persevering, yeah, we should want our kids to be persevering and not to be quitters. But parenting needs to be Christian parenting definitely needs to be aimed at the heart, as opposed to just like the behavior. Like, oh, I got my kid to do what I wanted them to do and to stick with it. But if they like resent you for it, or they resent the activity, whatever it is, like, I mean, yeah, you got them to do what you wanted them to do, but like, why were they doing it in the first place? And was their heart really in it, right? So persevering, sticking it out, not quitting is important, but not as an end goal in itself, right? It's only that if that's exposing them to experiencing something even deeper and more important. And lastly, like, yeah, of course, we should want our children to perform well in whatever they are pursuing, but definitely, like, instead of performance-based affirmation, performance-based parenting, I mean, Christians are like, nah, we have to critique that, because we believe in the gospel of grace. And so there's got to be that grace-based parenting where, in performance-based parenting, and Karis, you might be familiar with where I'm getting this. If you've grown up in PCA churches, and you've probably heard Tim Keller be quoted uh, plenty of times. But I would say performance-based parenting would say to kids, you wouldn't explicitly say this, but this is the message they're getting, is that, you know, a kid is like thinking, I seek to obey my parents and I strive to please them. Therefore, I receive their love and acceptance. So because I'm seeking to obey them, I'm striving to please them. Therefore, I get their love, I get their acceptance. Grace-based parenting flips that around. It's the kid recognizing and enjoying the fact that I receive my parents' love and acceptance. That's first and foremost. Therefore, I seek to obey them. I strive to please them. And so in the end, we want the same outcome of I want you to obey. I want you to strive to please me by pursuing these goals. And but it's all about the heart and the motivation. Like, are they doing it in order to try to earn my love and acceptance? Or are they doing it out of the security and the confidence that they already have their parents' love and acceptance, and that's what's motivating them? Is it coming out of a place of fullness or a place of emptiness, and they're trying to fill up their heart with love and acceptance? And so I think that's two different ways. And in the tiger parenting, the real, performance based, like, yeah, I think that leads to a lot of resentment and a lot of just exhaustion, always striving to please my parents because they're coming out of a sense of emptiness, and they're hoping that if I can just achieve this, then I finally earned their approval. And grace-based parenting, Christian parenting is like, no, you already have it, out of grace and out of this place of confidence. Now, I want to see you, still strive in these ways, but out of a completely different heart. So, anyways, those are some of the things where I was thinking about. Yeah, that's my stereotypical view of Chinese immigrant parenting and the kind of characteristics of that. And I don't want to just completely reject it as a Christian parent. I do want to affirm what can be affirmed, but I definitely think there needs to be things to be critiqued, and hopefully that kind of helped in kind of identifying some of those things.
Yeah, for sure. I think so many things about that. I think first of all is very key that you found a kind of answer in between the two extremes instead of throwing one out.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and secondly, I think like the idea of a performance-based versus grace-based parenting and how that even then translates very well into how is your kid thinking through their own faith journey in terms of are they
Yeah,
like often we project what we think our father, onto God.
yeah.
So to take it that way, have you seen a lot of people specifically in like the Chinese church culture taking a performance-based like
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're saying that has the way that they've been parented and raised impact their spiritual journey? That is basically what you're asking? Yeah, yeah. And having, grown up in the church as a teen in a Chinese heritage church, and then I was a youth leader, doing youth ministry, and then also college ministry as well. Yeah, I could see that. That totally correlates. Where if they grew up, even if they had Christian parents, and yet they were still growing up in a culture, in a home where they were being, um, they were still chasing their parents' approval and acceptance and love, then yes, that definitely means that highly likely they have a more moralistic view of the Christian faith, and that they are approaching their faith and following God, whether, you know, they wouldn't be like the explicit Pharisaical legalist, like I have to work to earn my salvation. They were never. I think they've grown up in the church well enough to know, like, oh, Christianity teaches, we're saved not by works but by faith. They could be able to explain that, and they wouldn't see themselves as moralists, but yeah, I think that definitely um ends up it's being manifested in the way that they uh, interact with God, where it might lack the kind of affection that they also lacked with their own parents and things like that. So yeah, I can totally see the correlation there. And so yeah, definitely. I mean, parenting is discipling. I mean, they're really, it's intense, focused discipleship on just, the kids in your own home. But yeah, it's the way you parent, you are discipling them, whether intentionally or not, and they are being shaped spiritually, for better or worse by your parenting style. And so that's just, yeah, it does, it does put any Christian parent in a position where they're like, oh my goodness, I totally need God's help. I need God's grace. Um, and I need to be more intentional with the way that I'm parenting because it does have a spiritual impact on your kids.
Mm. I'm interested to hear what you think the root of tiger parenting as you've seen it is. Like, what is driving parents to parent?
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder if it has to do with just we can say with our lips that we know we are saved by grace and not by works. And yet, in our own experience of Christianity, we still have a very performance driven mentality. And so it then translates into a high performance based mentality in the home. And so, yeah, I do wonder if, where there's a lot of churches, Christian ministries that definitely would affirm the gospel and they would have a statement of faith where, yeah, there's the gospel right there. But then after that, it's very much assumed that everyone knows the gospel. And so we can be able to focus on more pragmatic teachings. And the gospel kind of gets just assumed and kind of put in the background. And I wonder if that's also then translates into where it's hard for us to connect the dots. And if I really do believe in the grace of the gospel, then how does that actually translate over to something like parenting styles and the kind of relationship that I'm forming with my kids? So I think the fact that we often kind of assume the gospel and it kind of takes the background in our churches, and a lot of pragmatic, practical teaching is in the foreground, then it probably sometimes is harder for us to then translate gospel realities into our practical parenting style. And so I wonder if that's where a recovery of a gospel centered ministry within your church, and then even into your own marriage and your home family life, allowing the gospel not to be just this thing that we all just confess, just with our lips, but it actually, grace is something that characterizes the way I interact with my family members, with my own kids in this case. So the fact that sometimes that's not prevalent or present in the church as a whole, we don't know what that really looks like, then obviously it's harder to know what it looks like in our homes.
Do you think that there's an impact of fear or control that has to do with also not just even digesting what grace really looks like when parenting your kid?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, because we're like we still want to control the outcomes, as opposed to yeah, I could see that as well in terms of knowing that, yeah, knowing that if I really believe that I worship a God, a gracious God who is sovereign and all sovereign, all powerful, and all wise, and He graciously calls me into a relationship with Him, then there are going to be, if I really believe that, then there are going to be times where I'm just going to have to trust Him on that. Trust Him on certain outcomes and certain events and circumstances in my life that I don't understand, I don't get. Um, and yet that's hard to let go of control. But if I truly believe that about God, then I am able to trust them. And so in this case, like really trusting that ultimately, God, I know that these are actually your children, that you are the sovereign owner of all things, even including these kids. So technically, like you own these kids. They're your kids that you have given to me to steward for a particular season of their lives. And if I truly believe that, then I know I can't control their outcomes. I can only do so much with my stewardship. And so I think that, yeah, my a proper understanding of God as being truly the sovereign Lord and owner and ruler of all things does definitely allow me to release control over my own kids and their outcomes, and to trust and to not be gripped by fear. So yeah, I can totally see how um, having a healthy view of God and his ownership, his sovereignty, his lordship, his rule, can definitely help address some of those tendencies we have to want to be so hands-on and control the future and the outcome of our kids. Because in the end, yeah, like I said, like they're yours, Lord. And I'm going to do my best to steward them. But I know that in the end, they're going to stand before you and be accountable for their own lives. And I can only do so much in the early years to help disciple them and point them in the right direction. But I got to trust the final outcome in their lives is going to be in the Lord's hands.
There is another question that was just came into my head while you were talking.
Yeah.
Something that someone had commented to me once was like they were watching Crazy Rich Asians, the movie,
Okay. Yeah.
the other day, and they were like, I just don't understand how like you can have all these women like the mother, such like a piece of work, is saying like she's a Christian and she leads a Bible study as the first
Uh,
like thing. And I was just wondering if you had any comment on the extent to which Christianity has been kind of linked into the Asian American communities especially as like this connecting piece and like I guess just kind of that whole interplay.
yeah. In terms of like the way that it's more, I guess you're saying that in some communities it's more normal for an Asian American to be a churchgoer, but then you're asking about the interplay of like sometimes it's it's become just more cultural, I guess.
Yeah, I think
Christianity
so.
has become more
Like you
cultural
don't
within.
expect that. Yeah.
Yeah, because yeah, you would think that like culturally you could imagine within more of Caucasian communities, cultural Christianity, but you're saying that even now there are some pockets where you could see that cultural Christianity even within Asian
Yeah.
American circles.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, yeah, definitely. I, I can, I can speak to an extent on that. I would say from my church in particular, um, there's not that. I mean, because our Chinese congregation are going to be probably more newer immigrants, and so they're more being exposed to the gospel like when they come here to the States, and so there's not a very long legacy of faith for a lot of the Chinese families at our church. Like some of them are the first Christians, right? Um, so they guess so. On one hand, there is a little bit more vibrancy because they chose to follow Jesus themselves and to go to church and to bring the. So I guess yeah. On one hand, I don't um, see that as much in some of the Chinese families here because of the dynamics of them being newer immigrants. But definitely on the English side, there's going to be more of a generation now, like myself and others, where I have peers here who did grow up in the church, so there probably is some of that in play. Um, yeah, I would probably just say, I mean that's this it's just it just goes to show um how uh, deep our sin nature can run, right? Where we can just be, basically how hypocritical Christians can be, and how I can be in my own peers, in my church member. So yes, that probably is a unfortunate um, factor, is that we have kind of hijacked a little bit of authentic Christianity, and a lot of it is just kind of where even though we're claiming to be Christians, and we are, but it's just some of what we're doing is baptizing certain aspects of our Asianness and sanctifying it, and passing it off as this is what Christianity is. I wouldn't be surprised if some of that is happening even in my own experience, and others. So I wouldn't want to say that, oh, we don't deal with that. But I would just simply say that that's where um, uh, I think you're going to find that anywhere, in any culture, and that's where I at least appreciate being in a Chinese heritage church, where there is, I think, more of an awareness of like the interplay of culture and faith, because of the fact that we do have a lot of people new to the faith, because they didn't have that kind of legacy of faith for them, because they were again first Christians possibly in their whole family line, right? So I think they're I mean, just for example, at our church, Houston Chinese Church, I think a number of us can point to oh, that's a very Chinese Christian thing to do, right? Like we can identify that that's just what Chinese Christians like to do, or they prefer, or that's our that's the way we do ministry. But we're very well aware that our white Christian friends, the more majority culture white churches, they don't do that, right? And so we are very much more aware of that's a very Chinese Christian thing, versus some of my Caucasian Christian pastors or friends in their majority culture church. I think sometimes because Christianity is so dominant in their heritage, that they just think that's just the way we do church, and that's just how Christians do things, and they're like, no, that's a very white Christian way of doing something, whether it's the worship style or whatever it is, where I don't think they are able to, unless, I mean, they might be receptive to it if you're able to point it out. But I think someone in my church is even far more attuned to the fact that, oh yeah, that's a very Chinese Christian thing. We have our jokes about that, right? So that's something where it's probably true, but I think being in a context like ours, hopefully it mitigates against some of that, because of the fact that at least we're more attuned to the fact that, oh, we got to be careful that we're not just it's Houston Chinese Church, right? That's the name of the church, but we got to make sure we're stressing that it's church is the biggest. If you had a logo, church has got to be the biggest, right? Instead of being Houston and then Chinese is the biggest emphasis, and then church is smaller in font. No, I mean, if we ever had something we would want to make sure we're stressing we are a church first and foremost, that happens to be a church with a Chinese heritage, and we happen to be located in Houston. And that's something that we're very more attentive to, the dangers of, if you're not conscious and you're not intentional, you could definitely allow the Chinese to take over, and that become the dominant characteristic of our community. So I think at least it probably happens, but hopefully in our context we're just more aware and careful of trying to resist that. So I don't know exactly answer your question, but I do know what you're talking about in terms of yeah, is do you guys do that because that's just part of just Chinese culture, conservative culture, or is that actually coming out of a convictional, a biblical conviction? Right? I mean, so those are examples where we have to be more attentive, that we're not just doing church in a certain way because that just fits with our more Chinese, more conservative cultural kind of attitude and experience. So, is that kind of what you were trying to touch on?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I think
Yeah, no problem.
in Chinese churches, like I can definitely see the push and pull
Yeah.
through the church. Yeah, so like kind of changing gears a little bit here, talking
Yeah.
about parenting. What do you think are some unique challenges that your kids face as pastors' kids?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely, just as a pastor's kid, where they're going to be this experience, having that experience where everyone knows them, uh, and everyone knows who they are, though they don't know everyone in the church. I mean, I being in a Chinese heritage church where there's multiple congregations, I have to experience that as well. Like if I go to Chinatown, I gotta be like on my best behavior because I might be sitting down in a restaurant, next to a family that actually goes to my church, and I don't even know because they're on the Chinese side. They know who I am. They see me like parenting my kids well or poorly. And so yeah, they have to experience that same thing where like they're I think our church culture is healthy enough that they don't feel like the fishbowl. At least I think. I mean, I probably need to talk to my 12-year-old more about the kind of pressures that she feels. But I try to be careful not to um, use our experiences in the family as just fodder for like sermon illustration, right? And if I ever do talk about her, I always want to make sure I gotten her permission first. And I usually always talk about her in which she's it's in a positive sense. I try never to use her as a negative example for anything, right? Because she's there, she's sitting right there in a congregation ever since she was young. And then so even for our 2-year-old, well, 2-year-olds only she's not there during the sermon, but yeah, eventually she'll be there as well, right? So yeah, but I think her growing up in a Chinese heritage church, I've just now, because now the oldest is a preteen, right? And she's now starting to kind of notice the difference, about being in like a youth group with Chinese American friends, and I think she's now exploring more of her Chinese American identity, and so I'm glad that she's at HCC in a context where she can be able to explore and be in a place where she knows others are going through the same journey. So yeah, that's been a newer experience, especially as she's going into 7th grade, right? So that's at the time where I remember I was wrestling with a lot of identity issues, and I could see her kind of going through that right now.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think as a pastor's kid, definitely can relate
Oh,
to
you are. You're a
yeah,
pastor's
I'm a
kid.
pastor's kid
Okay.
myself, so it's always fun for me to
Nice.
hear the different perspectives of like
Yeah, yeah,
pastors' kids and their parents as pastors. But yeah, thank you for sharing.
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of add on to this in terms of you kind of talked about the importance of the community's eyes, I guess, kind of on you guys like a lot of the time.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah.
but I was wondering if you could speak to how important you think the church community was in raising your daughter and your 2-year-old as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I very much am appreciative of our church. Um, I guess part of it is just really trying to make sure that we involve and integrate our kids into the life of the church. So, like for example, typically in a Chinese heritage church, you've got like a Friday night fellowship, right? So you guys grew up in a Chinese, Friday night fellowship, and all the adults they go to their room with their fellowship, and then the kids go to Awana, and then the youth go to youth group, and once you step into the doors of the church, like kids go one way, adults go the other, and I'll see you afterwards, right? For either lunch, Sunday lunch, or I'll see you afterwards for after fellowship, snack. Um, and that's something where we really wanted to expose, especially now in this case, I'm talking about my experience with the oldest daughter, so that she was with us through most of our church life, church experience. So, for example, like at an early age, we'd still bring her to service, the worship service. Now, when she was like, even with a 2-year-old now, like she'll stay in until the sermon time, and then my wife will take her to the nursery. But at least she's there to see mom and dad. Like I'm holding her while I'm worshiping Jesus, and she's able to see a baptism or things like that. And so like and now my oldest, ever since she was in elementary school, I was exposed to all of that. And being in the worship service, where that's just normal to her. And then even for like small group, we tried to conduct our small group in such a way where, like, when we're at the dinner table and everyone's going around sharing, like my daughter was expected to share as well. How was your week? Do you have a prayer request? They're very often very simple responses, but like she and some of the other kids were treated like a member of the group, so that when she was growing up, she would say like our small group, and when she says our small group, she's talking about like mostly adults, right? But that's, in her mind, that's my small group, which I think that was something there where she was able to have these relationships with some of these adults, where she saw them as we're part of the same group together, and they had an investment in her life. So I think that was something that we had to be intentional with, because I think the natural uh, kind of flow of church life in the Chinese heritage church is pretty segmented and separated between adults and children. So we had to try and I think culturally in our English congregation, we're trying to still move in that direction. I think a lot of parents, younger parents, are responsive to that. But yeah, but that's something where like I realized that me and my wife are not going to be enough when it comes to being spiritual influences in their lives. That these kids need us for sure to be the primary disciplers, but they need other Christian adults that they can be able to see also being as serious with their faith, and they can be able to have conversations with them perhaps that they might feel they might be more comfortable with talking to them about, um, or that they're just able to connect with my daughters in a way that I might not be able to, and I shouldn't be intimidated by that. If there's a young adult who really like my daughter really connects with and sees as this great spiritual mentor and example in her life, like I should not be at all like, oh wait, I wanted to be that person. Like I should not be intimidated. I should be very grateful, and knowing that we're partnering and working hand in hand. So I think that's kind of the mentality we're trying to foster, is that it takes a village kind of a mentality. So I do appreciate that on the English congregation side, we're seeing obviously more families, and so you've got these like third generation Chinese Americans, right? So like I'm second generation, my parents being first generation. Now they've got the third generation, and now they're growing up, and it's it's an interesting, it's a newer dynamic in terms of our parenting style and relationship with them than it was with our parents, right? And so it's a great experience for all of us as we're seeing these third generation kids growing up in the church, and seeing and Lord willing, faith is gonna be formed in them and stick with them. So I'm sure we're making our own set of mistakes, but at least we're hopefully learning from things from the way that we experienced growing up.
Definitely. I think it's really important that you do have those spiritual mentors that aren't necessarily your parents, although
Yeah, yeah,
kind of going on to like the role that you play in your
yeah.
daughter's, spiritual life. I guess to what extent would you say that you're involved in her spiritual life and journey?
Yeah, yeah. And then for my wife as well, right? Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the biggest choices that we made that impacts this, it answers this question, would be our choice to um uh well, we don't technically full on homeschool our daughter, um, but we are part of a Christian classical collaborative school in Houston. It's called Trinity Classical School, and it is basically, it's a private school, Christian private school that's in classical education. But the way that the school format is that there's 2 days on campus, so Mondays and Wednesdays. It's just like a Christian private school. You're on campus, you have your own teachers, but then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, when you're an elementary age student, that's home days with the co-teacher, which is one of your parents, and your parents are co-teachers with the teachers at school in your education. When you hit middle school, they add Fridays as well as a home day, and into high school as well. So that has provided an opportunity for my wife and myself and now with the 2-year-old at home, I'm often taking care. So it's my wife actually doing the lion's share of the homeschooling. And she works for the school as well, so it's a little convenient for her as well because she's very familiar with the material. So yeah, that allows us to be aware of what she's learning educationally, but also it's Christian school, so a spiritual formation component is built into the curriculum. So that's probably going to be the most hands-on thing that we are involved in, and basically taking part along with the educators of the school in terms of the spiritual formation of our kids, not just their academics, but like I said earlier, the more important thing about their character. And the things that I mentioned earlier, just about exposing them to church life, like everything that we do, we want them to be, generally a part of it, as opposed to like just kind of putting them off into children or youth ministries with the child care type of mentality, like, oh, take care of my kids while I go do my adult thing. Like we try to resist that. And yeah, so I think, and also continued reading to my kids and conversation. So like even at a very early age, read to my daughter with the second, the 2-year-old now, still trying to, keep that going, where we've read through, I don't think we haven't read through the whole Bible, but definitely read a lot of Bible and other books as well, a lot of good Christian books in terms of fictional books. Like Chronicles of Narnia and things like that, right? So those are things where I just wanted to really have a habit of reading with my kids. So by God's grace, my oldest is a reader, and so she enjoys reading. So that's so good. And now trying to get her to be more intentional in reading the Bible, not the kids' Bible, but the actual read this actual English translation of the Bible. And then having conversations with her about that. And so now it's, it's age appropriate. So now we're getting to the point where I really want her to ask me questions, and I try to, draw some of that stuff out. So that's kind of some of the intentional things that we do in our family.
Yeah, great to hear. I know you mentioned a little bit about like education in Christian school earlier.
Yeah.
Asians have especially Asian parents, they have the reputation of being really overbearing in terms of education and demanding all A's or really high performing academic statuses. So I was wondering, what is your take on that, and kind of how does it work for you and your kids and your family?
Yeah. So I kind of I did mention that a little earlier in the interview, how we do care about academics. I mean, that's why we want to be more involved in actually knowing what our daughter's learning and being a part of teaching her that. So that's why we do enjoy this kind of setup with the school that we're a part of. But yeah, like my wife would say, she's an educator, and so and now she's more in the kind of the leadership side. So she's like training teachers, and what she would say is that, look, you can get your kid, to learn your ABCs, learn how to read and learn algebra and all. I mean, yes, that stuff is of course we care about, and your kids are, for the most part, unless they have some, unique learning disabilities, like your kid is going to get those things. But what we're more concerned about is their character. Not only we're talking about Christian character, Christian values, but also just being a lifelong learner and to love learning for the sake of learning, not just because I need to grasp this material because I'm going to be tested on it, and then I need to get good grades so that I can get into a good college. So, just a very pragmatic, career track mentality. Like we don't want to instill that with them, especially at a young age. We just want her to actually be a lifelong learner, and again, like I said, a voracious reader. Like those are the things that we were hoping for, and at least with the oldest one, we're like, all right, praise God, that has been instilled. The second one, we'll see. It's too early to tell. But yeah, so those are the kind of things where I care more about that. So especially right now, she's a seventh. She's gonna be a seventh grader. Yeah, she gets really good grades. But I don't really so I mean, we don't have to worry about that with her. All of my conversations with her, especially since my wife is the one doing most of the academic teaching, I'm trying to have conversations with her about things that she might be struggling with whether it's with faith, whether it's socially, like, because I care more about her, first of all, being a lover of Jesus, a follower of Jesus. And I just want her to be a good friend. And I want her to be like, someone that people trust and want to be friends with. And I mean, those are all the character stuff that like I care so much more about than, looking at her report card. And maybe it's because we're just blessed by the fact that it ends up being like A's anyways at this stage. But even if it wasn't, I honestly I don't think I would care. Maybe because I wasn't a straight A student myself, and like I said earlier to Karis, like my parents weren't super strict on that with me. But yeah, so that's where I could totally see the stereotype. I could see the dangers of that about idolizing academics and making life all about like you got to get into this college, you got to get into this grad school, and you need to be on this career path. Because again, I'm trying to prepare her for eternity, not just for for however many decades of a particular career, right? So, anyways, that kind of shapes my attitude towards it.
Yeah, the funny thing is I feel like I can very much resonate with the experience of your daughter because I went to a classical Christian school like from 8th
Ah,
to 12.
is
So
it 5 day or is it was it
it
5 day
was
school?
5 day,
Okay,
yes.
yeah, yeah,
Then
yeah.
honestly being like during COVID, like I think I got a bit of the remote
Oh yes,
homeschooling, so I
yeah,
kind of have both. But
yeah,
yeah, I would love to hear a little bit just in terms of not only your thought process through that decision, because I know even my parents, I've gone through like a ton of different types of schools and
Mhm.
figuring out whether or not, especially even like with each kid and their personality, like which school should we send them to? So not
Yeah.
your thought process through that, but also the idea that like we are to be in the world but not of the world. And what
Mm,
does that
yeah,
mean in terms of being in a bubble for some
yeah,
part of your formation, but
yeah,
also yeah, just your thoughts on that.
yeah, yeah. No, good questions because I definitely, we definitely wrestled with some of that. So one is we didn't like, I mean, obviously we're more committed now, especially with my wife working for the school. So as long as she's still employed and working there, I can imagine my kid going all the way from K to 12, right? Um, and all her friends are there. So I mean, she's very happy and contented at the school. And it's because she's responded well to that kind of education where it's highly emphasis on the liberal arts, on the humanities. Like if you're not a good reader, like you will struggle at this school. And so like I definitely am aware that there are other families that eventually they moved on because they realized that it had to fit their kids' learning style as well. So yeah, I definitely when I tell other families in the church about our school, I definitely try not to make it sound like, oh, this is the mature Christian option for education. Like, no, if it works, if your kid responds well, then that's great. Um, and then secondly, yeah, that's probably the one thing that we wrestled with early on, and all of the families we talk to do wrestle with, where the whole, I want my kid to be like, in the world, obviously not of the world, but I want them to be in the world. I want them to go to public school, to have non-Christian friends, so that I can then become friends with their non-Christian parents. Like, that's something, yeah, definitely being in a Christian classical school, you're not gonna, well, I mean, now again, who knows if all the parents actually are Christians? You can be a nominal Christian. So definitely there are opportunities to still have gospel conversations and have a gospel influence on some of the other families. But yes, for the most part, they're all going to be committed Christians in the school environment. And so we just have to be more intentional when it comes to our neighborhood, when it comes to some of the extracurriculars. Those are things where we're going to have to find ways to be exposed to just unchurched people, non-Christians, because yes, that otherwise you can just be in a bubble because her parents also. I mean, her dad also happens to be a pastor of a church, so like her world can be very much this like Christian bubble. Um, so yes, that is something we need to be more intentional with when it comes to some of because the advantage of this being a school that's not 5 days is that they expect you for a lot of the extracurriculars. They can't provide it. So they're like, you will have to find that on your own. So that's where we would have to be doing that in the community. And then the other factor is, yes, I want my kid to have a missionary mentality, where they, really see themselves as, if when if she's converted to Christ and she is an ambassador for Christ. She's a Christian. I want her to have that missionary mentality, but at the same time, like I wouldn't send, a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old to the mission field right now on their own. So even though, yeah, I want them to see their school as a mission field, at the same time, I have to realize um, that our public schools aren't necessarily these value neutral, spaces where it's just a blank canvas when it comes to values and worldview. So at the same time, I see it as they're being discipled in the public schools, and in ways that would be inconsistent with how the vision I have for my daughter in terms of what I pray and hope for. Not to say that you can't faithfully and effectively raise Christian kids in the public education, but if you do so, you just have to be aware of how they're being spiritually formed in a way that is inconsistent with your Christian faith, and you need to be able to prepare them for that and counteract that, and not just to expect that what their experience at school is completely value neutral. So that's where that's one thing where I recognize that, like, I do want my daughter, like I do hope she goes to college. I don't expect it to be a Christian college. And so I know at some point she's going to be in an environment where she's going to be the minority in terms of faith commitment. And so I want her to be well prepared for that. And so all these early years is I'm just trying to invest in her, and her school is trying to invest in her to prepare her, letting her know. And early on, I would always try to remind her that not everyone believes what we believe. And the thing is that we have non-Christians, in our own family, like my parents, so our siblings and our parents, me and my wife, all non-Christian. So that always is a constant reminder to our daughter that not everyone believes this. And so you need to realize that there are others who have a different point of view, different worldview. So that's something that we have to be intentional with to prepare her for inevitable exposure, where she's going to be, the odd person out when it comes to faith. So yes, definitely, these are decisions that So when I talk about this with families, I try to be very careful that I don't make this into like a secondary issue. Like Christians should all do this with education. You know what? It works for me, works for my family. This is the reasons why we do it. Here's the pros and cons. You need to come to a decision on. I think this is a real third order tertiary issue that Christians can disagree on whether on how you should educate your kids. I think there's some basic principles that we should all agree upon because it's in the scriptures. Like things like, you are the primarily responsible to steward and disciple your kid, like things like that. But beyond that, like where you send your kid to school, what kind of school, I think those are things that, we can come to different conclusions on. So I try to be very careful not to like make it sound so dogmatic, like, hey, if you really want to be a faithful Christian parent, then you got to do it this way. I definitely don't see it that way when it comes to some of the school choices that we've made.
Yeah, definitely. Really interesting to hear about like your thought process in deciding to go this unconventional route. What do you think is something that your children have kind of taught you as you've been parenting them as like they've been growing up?
Oh man, yeah. No, I mean, yeah, teaching me about like my impatience for sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's my selfishness. I mean, just even just at an early stage of parenting, and how like I could be so distracted from parenting them, by my phone, and wanting to get immersed into my own world, doing into my work, and they're crying out to play with me, and I'm like, oh, hold on. So yeah, definitely how it has definitely exposed just how like self-centered I can be, and so convicted plenty of times about that growing up. And then now I don't know if you guys are familiar with the TV show Bluey. Like every time I watch Bluey, I'm just like, oh my goodness, oh, it's such a good show, but it's so convicting. I don't know if you guys are familiar. It's like this cartoon, this really really well made kids cartoon, but it's actually really like parents love it as well. But basically, the dad is like super available and always playing with the kids all the time, and it's like so convicting. Of like, oh man, how does he have so much time? I know it's a cartoon, you know, it's not real life, but it definitely does like expose like, yeah, like I need to be more present. I need to be more available. Even though I might physically be there, I can be checked out. And those are the kind of things where it really has exposed a lot of my self-centeredness, my selfishness. Yeah, so that's one thing that comes to mind.
Mm. I was also wondering in terms of navigating the idea that the church is kind of like an extension family, like the body of Christ. How do
Yeah.
you navigate the difference between your own family as this kind of smaller pod, but then also viewing the responsibility of the whole church as well?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, especially as a pastor of the church, yeah. So definitely, yeah, that definitely is that tension. And I think all pastors, and Karina, maybe you know your dad's as a pastor probably you know wrestled with that as well. And I don't know how you felt as the pastor's kid, whether he was doing a good job balancing that. And that's what I wonder: am I balancing it? I think an older generation of pastors, even in my church, some of my colleagues, I feel like had a certain attitude towards pastoring where it was like the family time is a sacrifice that you had just have to make for the calling of a pastor, where you have to shepherd the whole church. And so you know that's just like it comes with the territory. It's a cost, and the family has to just be able to see that ultimately this is going to pay off in the grander scheme of God. Just you know of what God. I think my generation of pastors, we're a little bit more attentive to like, you know, there are some costs that I don't think are healthy. And so I think I do sense that we're a little bit more protective, like my generation of pastors are a little bit more protective of our family time. But then I do wrestle with the tension of like, oh man, am I really as faithful? You know, I mean, maybe I am being a little selfish. So that is a tension that I definitely feel. But I am trying to be protective of, like, for example, like Mondays, like you know, that's my day off. That's my weekly Sabbath, and I really try not to do any work. And I try to just be present for my kids. So like yesterday, you know, taking my kids out, and just enjoying the day and trying to not think about work and then you know taking last summer I went on a sabbatical, like making sure that you know I avail myself of rest because you know I could just you know find myself just you know immersing myself because you know it's a kind of job where like you don't have a 9 to 5, like you can't just leave it at work, like it's always going to be you know coming at you, and so I have to be more protective. So yeah, definitely I do see like I am going to be the best most effective pastor if I can demonstrate to my flock that I am effective in even shepherding the little flock called my family. And that's why if you look in 1 Timothy 3, like one of the qualifications for an overseer, for an elder, for a pastor is he's able, you know, to shepherd his own family, right? So you do look at that as a qualification for his effectiveness and his qualifications to shepherd. So yeah, I don't see it as I'm trying not to see it as a competition, but like um the most effective I can be, like the more available and present father I can be, uh, allows me to be the best pastor by setting an example, right? So yeah, I know sometimes it does, you know, if someone's, you know, there's been an emergency, you know, there's someone, you know, emergency and they're in the hospital or someone just, you know, passed away, like, and I gotta be there. Even though I was scheduled to be at something with family, those are those times where, yeah, I think those are the costs where I understand, like, you can't just say, oh, sorry, not available. You know, I'm off the clock. I can't have that mentality because it's not that kind of a job. But at the same time, I have to be protective as much as I can. And when I am not working, I gotta really provide that kind of attentiveness. So yeah, that's something that I know I can do far better in, but I am trying to be more aware of the dangers of just being so invested in the shepherding the church that you lose your family in the process. Like that'd be like my worst nightmare if that were to happen. Right?
Thank you for sharing that. I think that was very
Yeah.
insightful. For our
No
last
problem.
question,
Yeah. Sure.
what's your biggest hope for your children in the future?
Yeah. I mean, I pray for their conversion. I mean, I'm trying to raise them in a Christian home, in a Christian environment, but I am not under any pretense that I am that I can just, raise them Christian. Like, I know that they need a sec. I mean, I know that they need a second birth. My wife and I provided them the first birth. They need a second birth. They need to be born again. That's something that's ultimately God's doing. And until then, they are non-Christians in my family. uh, and maybe this is all. Oh yeah, this is maybe my Baptistic um, uh, roots showing here as well. That I am waiting for their conversion to see signs of that, and then yeah. So I do pray that for signs of their conversion, for them to want to go public with their faith and to be baptized, and to really love the church and want the church to be central in their lives. So again, that's something that I hope growing up in our home with dad as the pastor of their church has given them a positive experience and view of the church. So when they go off to college, they're independent, that they still have a positive attitude towards it. But yeah, that's definitely my hope is that I tell my kids, and I tell the kids in the church, like, you need a firsthand experience of the faith. You cannot rely on inhaling secondhand faith. And you can be surrounded by Christians all, at home, at church, Christians all around you, and there's a secondhand faith that's in the air, but that will not be sufficient. That will not make you a Christian. You have to have firsthand experience. You have to experience, taste, and see, Jesus for yourself. And so, I mean, that's just all I really pray for, is that both my daughters will be followers of Jesus, and that they will marry well. Lord, if the Lord calls them to marriage, that they will marry well, a husband that also shares the same convictions of following Jesus. So yeah, I mean, those are some simple prayers, simple hopes for them, and that I hope we just don't we don't fail them in the sense that they grow up disillusioned and like tired of the church. I mean, yeah, I know that's always a possibility, and so we're trying to mitigate that as much as possible. That we're showing them an authentic expression of faith, where there is failure, there is disappointment, but there's also repentance, there's also forgiveness, and hopefully that sets them up well when they have to start taking those steps on their own.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah,
Um,
no problem.
Before Kara stops our recording, is there anything else you
Yeah.
want to add or share to this conversation?
No, I think that's, yeah. I mean, I've been very thankful for even just these questions, and even having, forcing myself to like think about it and be more, reflective. So I really appreciate. I got out a lot about it. Just the last couple of days, I was like, can't think. Well, how have I been parenting? And my wife, how have we been parenting, and are we meeting some of those goals? And so, yeah, this is a very good exercise for me. So I really appreciate the opportunity.